us an overview of what governance actually is.
So governance for your intranet, there's a couple of good ways to think about it. One is that it's like the day-to-day execution of your intranet strategy. So everybody normally starts off with like the grand vision of what the intranet should be. But the governance is then saying, well, day to day, how do you bring that strategy to life? So if you've got a vision of what your intranet is for, what are you actually going to do to nudge people in the right direction? So the classic one, for example, is about Viva Engage versus your intranet, what goes in the employee social network versus what goes on the published intranet. More recently, a lot of governance debate has been around guiding people on what happens on Teams versus what might happen on the intranet. And also, I'm sure we'll come on to it, there's a bit of a tug of love with HR systems and where employee questions might be answered. Does it go on the HR system or does that happen on the intranet and so on? So that's one way of seeing it. The other way is many years ago, I heard a guy from AvePoint say, good governance is like having good brakes on a car. It makes it safer to go faster. So you can think about governance as being a ready-made risk assessment of everything that people might do on your intranet platform. And the appeal of doing that is that rather than have someone coming along saying, can I change the branding of my site? Can I put this kind of information on the intranet? Can I commission this extra functionality module? And the answer being, oh, we don't know. We'll have to convene the governance board and get back to you in a couple of weeks. The idea is that you anticipate all of these requests, so you've got a ready-made answer, and then things go faster.
Great, thank you very much for that. So, given that it's a fundamental part of running an intranet and in the background of any digital workplace system as well, why are we talking about it today? Why is it a topic that 45 people right now are listening to live, but I'm sure many other people are going to watch this back later on?
Well, hopefully the questions that everybody's going to send us will tell us what people are interested in. But it's funny you say, why are we talking about it today? Because I think we've been talking about it for 30 years since intranets first appeared on the scene. It's a perennial problem. And everybody has seen the artist's impression of a new building, you know, when it's kind of put in the local press and say there's going to be this glorious library or office block and the streets look really neat and everybody, you know, there's no litter or anything and people are sitting neatly at coffee tables and all the trees are perfectly pruned. And then you look at that same building 10 years later and yeah, there's tents outside and there's broken down bits and bobs and the glass is cracked and all that. And that's reality of what happens when you bring things to life and start living in them. So back to that day-to-day execution of our intranet strategy, we're talking about it because this is the bit where intranets degrade from that shiny new launched intranet to the intranet you have today. And always when I talk to people about their intranet that's a few years old, what they tend to talk about is where it deviates from that grand initial design. And often when they say, well, you know, what's the lesson learned? It's we should have spent more time on governance and maybe less time on development or choosing the technical platform because it's what people do with it that makes it great or not so great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good analogy. I also think of it if you are putting in a new kitchen and then you let your kids come in and use it. It's like you need to have some rules in place that they don't stand on the chairs to open the upper cupboards and that sort of thing. So thank you for that then. So could you summarize for us then, what does good governance look like?
So being a consultancy, we have frameworks and models. We've got two ways of modeling governance. So one is what we call the governance pyramid. And these are what you might call the components that governance should look at. So at the very top, you've got the strategy. And then driving down from that, you've got roles, the site life cycle. So when the sites get created within that, when should they be removed, and content life cycle. And then underpinning it, you've got decisions about the governance of the platform. So technically, what can you do and not do? You got security, so what's safe and what's in line with other IT governance, which will of course go beyond the intranet. You've got compliance with legal things, so copyright being an obvious one around content. You've got information management, so things like metadata and findability of information. And lastly, you've got the brand, the design, and the UX, so the look and feel and alignment with the corporate brand. So when we talk about policy, which is what everybody thinks about when you talk about governance, which is like that big chunky written thing, you could see the list that I've just given you as being the table of contents as a start point. But the reality is that policy doesn't really bring governance to life. So you also need the other model we have, which is we call the 5 leaves of governance, which are the things that say, well, if people don't read that lovely policy document that I'm sure you sweated over for months and months, what are you going to do? Well, you have options. You have things like training in particular, and we can talk more about training. You can do things with constraints. So you can say, well, we can lock down part of the platforms unless you have the right permissions. You can't make changes in this way. You can use things like templates to have consistency with the layout. Then you can do things like monitoring, so analytics and alerts when people do things which cross governance boundaries. And you can have a steering group, which is like the overall accountability, who feels ownership for this. And again, if we go back to the town planning type analogy, if you think about using the roads, you have in the UK and in most other countries a highway code. You have a rule book that you have to learn to pass your test. But that isn't the only thing that keeps people following the governance for road use. You've got training. So yes, you have a test. You have people who need to be sufficiently skilled to operate within the environment. You have signage that reminds people of the rules. And on the intranet, you might say, when you're filling in a form, here's a little reminder of what we're looking for. And you can have physical barriers, just as you can have constraints on who can do what. You can put crash barriers in between lanes to stop people turning right where they shouldn't turn right. And when all else fails, you have the police, the cops, and the cameras that track it all and monitor it all and enforce compliance when you really need to.
So it sounds like there's a lot there to consider, and actually we've had a couple of questions come through already. I'm going to pose one from Karen, which is, my leaders don't understand why we need a governance document. What can I do to convince them?
Yeah, so I mean, what are the benefits of having good governance? So I think one is that speed of execution. So maybe you just start gathering queries that come in, or even examples of things that are happening that are outside what you would like. So the people dropping litter or whatever, and say, well, we need it because otherwise I've seen intranet managers run themselves ragged trying to be the cop without any backing. So having that upfront discussion about governance and saying, well, okay, leadership team, what will you back me in doing? What are I don't want to use the word powers, but what are the things where we all agree should and shouldn't be happening with the intranet? But I do agree to some extent that it isn't really about a big book of rules, not in terms of a big book of rules that everybody has to read before they use the intranet, because nobody will. Nobody's got time. It's just not a good read for anybody. The only real reason I think to do the policy document is to think it through, to have a working group that thinks it all through, and then it documents it as a reference point. Mm-hmm. But then to bring it to life, it is much more about training and maybe setting good examples as well, more so than necessarily dwelling too much about the wording. This isn't a legal contract with your employees. It's much more about guidelines to bring your vision to life.
So who should be responsible for governance then?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, because back to the last question, you want people with sufficient influence to back you. And that might mean, like your director of comms or someone senior in IT. But the reality is, I don't think they're going to get very hands-on. I've not worked with any senior people who said, right, let's roll up our sleeves and write a really big governance document. IT a little bit more so, because I think they understand the risks of not having rules in place. But on the whole, not massively down in the detail. So ClearBox, what we normally recommend is that you should have like a center of excellence or a competence center. And this brings together people who can represent the different aspects of that pyramid that I mentioned. So you might have someone who's a user experience expert that can talk about interface design, someone from marketing who's a custodian of brand, someone from legal who talks about legal compliance, and maybe HR for things that are to do with employee regulation, and get them to be more the working group that pulls this together. And then the steering group is the next more kind of senior level to sign off on it and maybe help you arbitrate if you get pushback. I've certainly been in situations where we're rolling out an intranet across lots of different countries, and there was one country that was like, no, we don't want your brand guidelines, we're going to do our own brand thing. And I had to get the head of communications to phone them up, and I sat there on the phone call doing this kind of peace negotiations to try and figure out a way forward. Which, what I said earlier about internet managers sometimes getting burned out on this.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it's really important to be realistic and pick your battles on this one. My personality type is to be very organized and structured, and even my freezer is very well designed in terms of how I pack the contents. That's not everybody's way of working. And in a large organization in particular, you're going to have to go with the flow a bit and say, well, culturally, what do we like? So if you work in like a marketing-led organization, probably, apart from brand, you're going to have to be quite hands-off and have governance that is more about carrot than stick, more about saying, well, here's an easy way of doing the right thing, rather than saying, thou shalt not do these 10 things. Conversely, I remember the British Standards Institute, the BSI, who, if you live in the UK, you might know the little heart-shaped kite mark thing that you see on car windows and stuff. I mean, they were about regulation and standards. That was an organization of a few hundred people, and all they thought about was writing regulations. And they loved governance on their intranet, because to them it's like, well, yeah, well, why would you have chaos? So they have very comprehensive governance, and like every time you uploaded a document, I think there were like 40 different metadata fields that you could fill in to really regulate and tie down all this stuff. You wouldn't get away with that in most organizations, but culturally for them, it was the right fit.
So I suppose thinking back to Karen's question about encouraging leadership, then if you understand the culture of your organisation and maybe where there are risks and things going wrong, would you say that's potentially an in with that leadership to make them understand in the context of your organisation, the context of your culture?
Yeah, and a lot of governance, it should be saying, well, what have we already got? And what are the implications for the intranet? So brand, there's normally someone in your organization that really cares about brand. So can you get them to champion the expression of brand within the intranet? And I think that's really important given hybrid working these days, that for many employees, the touch point with the brand will be the digital estate. It will be things like the intranet when they log on from home. It won't be going to the head office, which is the lovely glass and steel edifice that might have all your products or branding all over it. Most employees won't get to see that head office more than once or twice in their working lifetime with the company, but they will see the intranet a lot. They will see the systems that they're working with. So you can do that for brand. Legal, if you have a legal team, then normally there'll be things that they would see as high risk, and they can back you up on that. IT, in terms of protecting the platform, if anything, IT tend to be a little bit too draconian, and it's about negotiating with them about what you can and can't do that will not suppress people from using the internet at all. Okay. And comms often about tone of voice and things like that. We'll be keen on those things.
Of course, yes. Okay, so had another couple of questions come through. So the next one then is, in an organization with a plethora of platforms, how do you effectively steer content creators to use the right platform? Using the intranet correctly feels many times as a secondary question.
Yeah. So it depends who we're talking about here. So if it's a channel strategy, if, for example, you've got a community of people producing internal communications, then you can do that through a mixture of training and just communicating like a channels matrix and say this kind of content is best used for this kind of channel. Again, the extent to which you can really enforce that depends on the structure of how you do communications. So if you have a corporate communications function that everybody reports into, and there's a kind of an amassing of line management to someone who has the overall influence, you can do that more strongly than, for example, if you've got communication people who are affiliated with a particular division or business unit. So they're professionally, they're internal communicators, but they're not part of a comms function. When it comes to everybody else, because I think a sign of really healthy intranet is that it's not just communicators producing content, but it's loads of people who are responsible for looking after kinds of content and putting it out there. So it might be Sally, who looks after certain HR content, and Jenny, who has a whole bunch of help sheets about using IT systems. For them, I would always try carrot first and say, we're going to make it really easy for you, Jenny, can't remember what name was it, yeah, Jenny, to do all your help sheets in this space. And here's a template, and we'll sit with you and we'll work with you and we'll get that going. And the other thing you can do is by showcasing good practice. So if you are an organization where there's, for example, lots of product specification sheets or how-to guides, a kind of documentation, then find one department who's willing and work with them to create a really good example of how to do this well on the right channel, whatever it is, and then publicize it. So we've worked with some organizations of tens of thousands of people, and they've had a loose community of intranet publishers. And every month they've done a kind of a lunch and learn internal webinar saying, let's have a look at what Jenny's done on her department, or we've got a new feature. Here's how to make the most of it, and pushing people towards doing the right thing within that channel. The other thing is just recognize that if people do use the wrong channel, it's probably not malicious. It's probably just because to them it seemed like the easiest thing to do, or the only one that they were aware of. Do some coaching, have a word and say, oh, I see you published all of your reference material in Viva Engage. The problem with that is that it's hard to maintain and it may not be indexed as well by a search engine. Why don't we work with you and move it over to this other area where it would be better served?
I think there's a good point there around finding out why as well. So as you say, it's unlikely to be malicious, but someone has done it for a reason.
Yes.
And if it's because you have an old internet platform in place, maybe, and they think that SharePoint is easier than the internet platform you have, then they're gravitating towards it or something along those lines. So it can be a very valuable research method to maintain good governance, is to then find out why has someone done this instead, and how have people reacted? Are people actually using it more? We worked together on a piece of client work a few years back, didn't we, where they had their intranet and they had Viva Engage, and they were really trying to get certain communications to go through the intranet, but actually Viva Engage was such a lively place that people quite often prefer to communicate and talk about particularly people related things on that platform instead.
Yeah. And maybe there's a point where you reflect and say, oh, is our governance wrong? Is that, if everybody prefers Viva Engage, what are the guidelines for making that, using it in the best way rather than trying to stop it? And I suppose that brings us on to the point about overzealous governance, where nothing gets published wrongly because nothing gets published. If you're so harsh about the thou shalt not, it turns people off and they don't bother. So again, a little bit of slack, living with something that's slightly messy is better than living with something which is completely empty. And we've seen lots of shadow intranets over the years. You mentioned SharePoint. It's really common if you have like a locked down central publishing platform that you've used for your intranet. We had one client that got a huge site core estate, but it was really hard to use and they were really strict about what you could do. So they were then playing whack-a-mole with all these little SharePoint sites that people could set up and did set up, because to them it felt like a whole lot less hassle than going through the official channels. I don't remember if you worked on it. So we even had one client where people were creating PDF documents with lots of pictures in that were hyperlinked. So you could click on those and it was like the launch page to everything about travel. You opened a PDF document, clicked on a link, and it would take you to booking taxis or booking hotels. And it was the most dreadful user experience. And you look at it and you think, oh my God, governance should stop that. But then your second thought is, what are they trying to achieve here? Because it's kind of interesting. They put a lot of effort into this, and it was their belief that good navigation was something that was quite visual. And really, it was an expression of the fact that the intranet, it was too hard to use to do modern style navigation. And really, it was a platform issue, not a governance issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I love being curious and asking why are people doing something when they seem to be doing something wrong. It can be quite enlightening sometimes. A little bit earlier, you mentioned something, and someone has now posed a question that we had on our list. So I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic. So looking ahead, how do you see intranet governance needing to evolve as AI becomes more involved in indexing, summarizing, and retrieving content? Are there any gaps you're seeing today?
Oh, I never guessed
tiny
AI would
topic.
come up, Susie. It's very fast moving, isn't it? I think we are still seeing quite reactive governance around this, but I'm reassured that many organizations have a broad AI policy, so not an intranet policy, but a broad AI policy. And back to what I was saying before, I think your best bet is to take that policy and say, well, what does this mean for the intranet, and add a layer of interpretation on top rather than an adjacent AI intranet policy. Probably the most immediate thing is going to be around content quality. So, Susie, I believe you work on a very nice report that looks at lots of different internet platforms. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I think I do, yes.
What's it called, Susie, for the benefit of everybody tuning in?
It's the Internet's Employee Experience Platforms Report. Comes out every January, and it does address or assess the best platforms that are on the market. And AI has certainly been one that's been evolving very quickly and a lot in the last couple of years. So governance really is rearing its head now more than ever. And it's quite nice to have a light shone on governance, because, as we've said at the start, it can quite often be forgotten.
It would be amazing if that report would be free to download, wouldn't it, Susie?
Yes, thank you.
Luckily it is. No, I'll be slightly playful, but yes, a lot of the innovations we've seen over the last year from product vendors are around agents that will take your content and answer questions in a kind of a natural language dialogue type way. The thing is that you need to be very careful about the content sources that it's using. So one thing is, you don't want it to answer a question about entitlement to leave based on someone's opinion that's been expressed in a comment section or in your Viewer Engage area. But also, you might legitimately have different answers according to where the person asking is based. So you might have different HR legislation based on one policy per country, and you need to make sure that the agent is looking at the right policy for the country of the asker. So I would say 2 years ago, some of the early forays into using the large language models were trying to create universal agents. And now we're seeing a bit of a pulling back and saying, no, it's better to say, hey, as an agent that will just answer HR policy questions or health and safety policy questions, and pointing it at a much more curated subset of all the content on your documentation estate. It might just be the intranet, but it might also be other sources. Last year, I was at a conference in Italy, and a manufacturing company had created an agent that answered diagnostic questions about issues of the production line. So over the years, lots of engineers had put in lots of solutions to, if you get this problem, then these are the 3 things we tried and this is what worked. And having an agent that would let you type in the symptoms and talk you through the solution, and you could say, try that, I didn't work, what else, was much, much better than trying to take all that experience and turn it into a handbook or a document. But it worked because it was constrained to things that were just about the one production line. It wasn't trying to do all the kinds of production lines that they did. So there's that bit. There's an awareness about the risk that comes from using AI. So I think everybody's aware of hallucinations now. But in regulated industries, there are lots of things where it wouldn't just be appropriate to have an agent generating content without the right layers of verification, human validation going on. So I'm thinking about if you work in finance, credit, insurance, all of those sort of things. And then the other area around AI to be aware of is about creating agents. So I'm not sure if it's still true, but certainly a year ago, there was quite a bit of concern around Copilot being applied to a SharePoint site. So you could create a Copilot agent for that site, but anybody could create the agent. So even if you weren't the site owner, someone else could say, oh, it's all right, I've done the agent for that library, off you go. And if you've been around in the corporate world for long enough, you'll probably remember, not so long ago, there would always be someone who was a genius with Excel that would create this really complex Excel spreadsheet with lots of macros. And everybody would start using, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. The department would become dependent on the Excel, and then the creator would leave, and everybody's like, nobody touched the Excel because if we break it, we'll never know how to fix it again. And in business, we go through these cycles of people creating things, and sometimes the homebrew solution is brilliant because it's created by someone who absolutely understands the problem they need to solve. But there's a governance gap if you don't then say, this is great, but then we need to formalize it and make sure that it's maintainable if we're going to rely on it for future work. Otherwise, we've just created a risk of something which is unmanaged but essential to how we do things.
And in terms of gaps as well, one of the big ones that surprised me when we were looking at tech this time round was that some agents don't respect security trimming. So you have to be, if you are introducing one, if you're introducing a digital assistant or even AI in search, it is really important to check whether that search can be scoped or whether it will respect those permissions, because if it doesn't, then you do need to think about, well, how do we reflect sensitive information or country specific information on the internet versus elsewhere. So it's definitely worthwhile finding that out. And the other thing for me is a conversation that we have with our colleague Wedge, which is around how information is actually presented on a page for people versus AI, because AI searches really like Q&As. It's why when you do a search on something like Google, you bring back something like Reddit, where people typically are asking a question and getting answers back. And the same is the true for an intranet. And so you have to think about how you're going to populate content in a way that will return nicely in a search, versus if I want to go and visit this page, I don't want to have to look through a whole load of Q&As to try and find the answer to something which I could just find in a block of text. So there's some interesting things to consider that I don't think vendors technology have really addressed yet. They're just going, oh yeah, you can do this thing, without actually working out the realities behind the scenes and what that means for usability. Shock.
And that's always been the way.
Yes,
There's an
yes.
interesting comment just came through from Magda. I don't know if you can see that, Susie, about turbocharging access.
Yes. So, Magda's good question. So, or a comment there. So, turning on AI search agent, putting in info from our intranet has turbocharged our need for governance and has made stakeholders finally sit up and take notice of what we have been flagging for a long time about review of content, keeping info up to date, making it accessible. We know it's not just an overnight thing to audit content and rebuild. So, yeah, AI can certainly help. And spark those questions and those conversations for sure. But it's also its own unique little thing in the governance framework that needs to be sorted out.
I mean, it's an immensely powerful retrieval tool, and it's back to, I think it was Karen that asked the first question about if stakeholders don't really buy into the need for governance. Well, these are the kind of things that can happen if you're not on top of it. But I'm reminded of when we first started doing enterprise search like 15, 20 years ago, and I was working in a big corporate, and the search engine started indexing lots of documents marked confidential, and security came along saying, well, you've got to turn it off. And like, well, no, we've done you a favor. We've highlighted a security risk for you because these confidential documents are not locked down. They were just hard to find. But now they're findable. You better get better processes in place. Otherwise, it will keep happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it's that learning from mistakes, learning from things that are going wrong and figuring out why and what you can do to fix it rather than necessarily worrying too much. Right, we've got a couple more questions come through, not on the topic of AI, although I'm sure we may very well get another one come up in a moment. So have you got any governance advice for an organization with a formal intranet, but also many hundreds of standalone SharePoint sites with no linked navigation? There is no governance in place other than standard IT policies.
Yeah, this is really in the pick your battles category, isn't it? So, Karen, thanks for the question. I'd certainly ask yourself, well, what do you need to govern? And again, you got to have governance tiers. So if you say your top of the pile is the formal intranet where it's highly curated, highly reliable, good quality content, then tightest governance for that. There might be a middle layer, which is, for example, governance for divisional content, where maybe 10 or 20%, a sizable chunk of your organization are likely to refer to it and reference it, but it's also a little bit more the work in progress. And then at the bottom of the pile is going to be the collaboration spaces, the day-to-day working, which might be within a department. Yeah, you might have a document library within a team site, for example, where it's a little bit messy, but people know the good stuff and people know the stuff that's version 1.1.3 brackets draft, which is less good. So at what point are you going to say, yeah, we can take on governing this because it matters, versus saying we're going to leave that to the owners of the standalone SharePoint sites to govern for themselves? So as a start point, what you might try to do is categorize. So just because it's a SharePoint site, not all SharePoint sites are the same. Is it an open one? Can anybody view it? Or is it a private one? If it's private, I'd probably leave it. If it's an open one that everybody can see, is it widely used? And what's the business risk of poor information management, or indeed of the owner of that site leaving the company and people still relying on outdated information and that kind of thing? So you could do a quick kind of risk assessment. If that all sounds too daunting, then the other way around to do it is to incentivize getting on board with the governance. So you could say, we are going to have a quality mark for certain SharePoint sites, and these are the criteria. I remember once there was a large corporate where they did have hundreds, if not thousands, of these sites, and they just said, well, if you want the search engine to index your site, then this is the 10-point thing that you have to comply with. Otherwise, we're just going to treat it as kind of out in the wasteland. You can do your own thing, but it's not going to get the quality mark.
And in order to find those SharePoint sites, I believe it's something that IT probably has to do. I think there's some quite in-depth reporting that would just give you a list. Is that right? So if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, so I mean the analytics within Microsoft 365 will give you a list, but there are lots of other third-party tools that do a good job of giving you a toehold on what's going on. So you could start out by saying, how big is the SharePoint site? When was it last accessed? How many people go to it routinely, and try and find the ones which are actively managed. You might need to work with IT and say, what's our archive policy back to the site life cycle part of our governance pyramid? Can we just have a blanket if it's not been touched for 12 months, then it goes into a frozen state for 6 months, and if nobody complains, it then gets archived. That kind of approach. You know what I was saying before about very strict versus very loose governance? I think you have to have, either easy come, easy go. So if it's very easy to get a site and do stuff on it, you also have to be pretty much, we're going to automate getting rid of the site. We're not going to get in a big discussion about each one. Or you can say, no, there's a gold standard of site. There are some criteria. For example, the site owner might need to go through some e-learning to demonstrate they understand what they're doing. But then we'll also put a lot more effort into keeping that site going and looking after it.
And also that link between what is it you actually want to make publicly available, what should be under the umbrella of your intranet and available to the majority of employees, versus actually it's okay to keep it in a SharePoint site because it's this little group of people and they're using it for a very defined purpose, I suppose, is also an earlier starting point rather than trying to tackle hundreds of them if that feels a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah. And I saw Karen came back saying we don't even know who the owners are. So sometimes we've been surprised when we've started working on a new intranet strategy and we just put it out there as like a corporate communications article saying, we're looking at the intranet and we'd be interested in your feedback. And we set up a engage group where you can come along and tell us your thoughts. We've been amazed at how many people come out the woodwork feeling quite passionately about being involved in this and saying, oh, I've got this site here, I'd love to be part of the bigger plan and have some input. So again, maybe you can get people to come forward who want to maintain the site but would welcome some guidance about how to do it, and start with them, or start by delegating, saying business unit by business unit, can you identify your sites and make it more of a collective effort rather than one or two people in the intranet team trying to take on eating the elephant.
Neat stuff. Good analogy as well. Okay, another question for you, slightly different this time. What's the best general approach to make sure that the intranet is married with your company's quality management system? Have you got any advice along those lines?
Not a core area of knowledge for me, I'm afraid, Jacob. I guess the best I can offer is that your quality management system is probably similar to things like legal regulation and IT regulation, in that it comes down to, well, what does the QMS say in general, and then what's the intranet specific take on that.
And also, if you are trying to access your QMS from your intranet, there are ways to integrate the systems together, if that's a way to kind of float some of the information. But also working together with, if you have a QMS, you probably have a person or a team that looks after it, and they'd probably be a really good one to get on board with a governance steering committee to help guide the governance in the first place as well.
Yeah, hearing you say that, Susan, I'm reminded, it's probably very similar to law firms that we've worked with that have the matter management system like iManage, where all the client work needs to go in a specific system, and there's a sensitive level of information that can't appear on the intranet. So a lot of that comes down to process documentation and saying very clearly what goes where, and doing a little bit of monitoring. So if you've got good analytics that will pick up on the wrong thing in the wrong place, again, have that kind of coaching intervention to say, oh, were you aware of this? Was that a mistake? Or picking up where education might need to happen.
You've mentioned analytics, and Holly has read my mind because I was just about to ask this question as well. What type of analytics do you find useful for supporting governance?
Yeah, this is, I think you'd agree, Susie, an area where platforms do differ quite a lot. So when we talk about analytics, often what people think about is usage analytics. So how many hits did this page? What was the what's the dwell time, and so on. But there's also governance analytics in the sense of what's the life cycle of this page or this document? Who is the owner? What's the secondary owner? And they can really help in picking up where your governance might be falling down. So if you have lots of orphaned content because the owner's moved on and no one else has picked it up, and having analytics that will automatically trigger reviews saying, this is an important policy document, every 12 months someone needs to validate that it's happened. Doing that manually, I've never seen it succeed. It's too tricky. Whereas doing it in an automatic way, where the named owner of the content gets an email saying this needs to be reviewed, and if they don't get anything back, then it goes to the secondary owner that might be the boss of the first person. And if you still don't get anything back, then it gets referred for manual intervention, saying, okay, this looks like we've got a problem here, Captain.
Yeah, you're right. There is a variety of different analytics and of different qualities across different platforms. Surprisingly, SharePoint has always been a little bit loose when it comes to analytics and governance related elements as well. Although with their investment in Copilot, that seems to now be changing, surprisingly.
I'm not at all surprised. Playing fast and loose has been SharePoint through and through.
Great stuff. Right. I think we've come to the end of the questions from people who have submitted any. I will ask one more question before we wrap up, just in case anybody wants to throw something in right now. Have you seen an example of good governance in action that you think has been really well executed that you can use as an example right now, just to give some people a little bit more inspiration?
Yeah, so I printed one out, and it's years ago. It's from Linklaters, the big law firm, and they basically came up with what they call design principles. You might think of them as golden rules. So instead of that big book of thou shalt not, they just had some really simple statements and expansions, like there should be one place to go, bring information into one place, join up process, people, and technology. Less is more. It's better to have less, but better managed content, screens with less clutter. And there are about 10 of those, but they were sufficiently pithy that you could get people to listen to them. The other one that I really liked was from a UK bank, where they took, what are the 15 things in our governance that we're really trying to achieve, and turned it into a scorecard. And every year they would sit with the owner of a section of the intranet and go through the scorecard, and where you get like a red, amber, green, and use it as a basis for a conversation. Say, here's how you can improve what you're doing. And often people, if you can get them to take pride in their section of the intranet and do it in a supportive way, you get much more lively, better maintained, more readable content than making it feel like it's a grudge. The bank actually then had a league table of the scorecards, which was presented to their steering group. So it was like finance is the bottom of the league table, and the representative on finance like, oh, well, we better do something. We don't want to be bottom again. So it was a good trigger for getting stakeholders to feel responsible for their section of the intranet too.
Great stuff. We've had another question come in about any experience or suggestions about third-party governance products from Rencore or ShareGate in particular, but to be honest, they're not ones that I've come across just yet. I'd be very happy to analyze them, but I don't have an experience. How about you? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so I know of ShareGate, and it's great as a governance tool from an IT point of view. So what is your physical estate doing? Just bear in mind that you'll still need to complement it with something that covers what you might call the softer side of what your internet's doing. So we haven't really talked about content guidelines and tone of voice and writing standards and all that sort of thing. They also matter, but by all means, ShareGate, or even things like Swoop Analytics and Engage. I'm sure you can help with a few more of the bigger analytics tools that all give you a point of entry into what's happening on the intranet. My feeling, if you're in the SharePoint world, is that the Microsoft Analytics are very good at telling you what your licenses are doing. They're not so great at telling you what your people are doing.
That's a very good point. And I would say if you're not on SharePoint, or if you're thinking about a different platform, there are some with intranets with very good inbuilt governance tools. You don't need a third-party system. There are some which can really support that lifecycle approach and automatic notifications and things. So sometimes you can get a good set of tools within your intranet solution.
And we're starting to see some AI come into that as well, aren't we, Susie, of AI assisted
Yeah.
governance, which I think is a really good move.
Yes, fingers crossed we'll start to see more. I think that's one area where the argument that AI will allow people to do more fun things. Governance is certainly one of those that's, yeah, less fun, I think is the fair way to describe it in the world of managing intranets. So anything that can support that would be great. Okay, I think we are at the end of the questions, so I'm going to ask you just one more to leave folks on. If you could give people listening just one tip, what would it be?
On the underground in Singapore, they have a big
Okay.
sign, which is a spiky fruit. It's just like the black silhouette of a durian. A durian's about the size of a watermelon, but it's this really stinky tropical fruit. And it's in a red circle with a red line across. And the message is don't bring durians on the underground because they stink. If people are not bringing durians onto your underground, you don't need to have lots of rules prohibiting it. So focus on the things that you really want people to stop or start doing, and don't burn yourself out thinking of all the possible terrible things they might do that they're not actually doing. So in the workshops that we run around governance, one of the first things I ask people to do is bring along 3 examples of where you think governance is working well already, and 3 examples of where it isn't working well. And we then distill those into, okay, so governance is really about affecting behavior. What should people stop doing and what should people start doing?
Great tip. Thank you very much for that, Sam. And thank you, everybody who's been listening. Some really good questions that have come through, and I can see conversations been happening in the chat too. We will share the recording with you in a few days. I've seen a request for some links to Intranet governance documents and links and that sort of thing. We will include that in the email that comes around. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Hopefully that has helped. And please do come along to the next Hot Seat webinar, which will be next month with Chris Tubb and Steve Wingle. Thank you very much again, Sam.
Love the questions. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. See you later. Bye. Bye.